always, thanks Miss Amanda and all of our kids and the helpers, and I have loved getting those children up from the children's ministry and coming into youth group. We had 4 of them up there this morning that are brand new, and we're just having a lot of fun. And it is neat to watch the continuation of our children come into youth, and then as they just continue to be a part of our beautiful congregation here. So every year, this magical thing happens in Methodist churches, United Methodist churches. Now, it's not every Methodist church every year, but every year in Methodist churches all over the country, this magical thing happens. See, a pastor will preach a sermon on Sunday, and then all the people will leave, and then the magical United Methodist fairy will come and sprinkle the United Methodist fairy dust all over the congregation. And when the congregation comes back the next week, there's a new pastor. It's amazing. And that's how the process works, for sure. But we're kind of in a unique space this week. The United Methodist Ferry is going to have a week delay between the leaving of Tyler and the starting of Brian, because little did we know when we were planning our Wesley Heritage pilgrimage, a year ago, that this move would be happening and that Tyler would not be here his actual last Sunday. So all over the United Methodist Church, pastors are preaching their last sermon right now, but not at Grace. We're in a special place this Sunday, and if anybody yells out purgatory, I'm going to take that offensively, okay? We're not in purgatory. I'm going to use a nice word. We're in a liminal space right now. Now, if you don't know what the word liminal means it's an in-between space. It's where what was is no longer, and what is to come is not yet. What once is no longer, and what is to come is not yet. And we don't find ourselves in liminal spaces very often in life. We definitely don't find ourselves in the United Methodist Church that way. It's one pastor out, one pastor in. It's a pretty seamless transition. But in liminal spaces, we have an amazing opportunity, not just in the church, but in life in general. Because when something has stopped, but the new thing hasn't started yet, it gives us a space to pause. It gives us a space to pause and to consider, to reflect, to think about who we are and what we are being called to be. It's a fallow space. It's a space for rest, for breathing, and reflection. And so this morning, I want to invite us intentionally into this liminal space. Now, we see loads of transitions in the Bible. We see loads of transition of leadership, of God's people moving from one way of being to another. And we could have looked at a lot of different stories in the Bible this morning to kind of inspire us in this transitory liminal space. As I was thinking about this sermon months ago and the trajectory, knowing kind of how unique this Sunday is, my mind kept going back to the story of Elijah and Elisha. Now, as Amanda said, they are 2 different people. It was really fun when a couple years ago when Amanda was like, wait, they're different? We're like, yeah. So we had to rework the whole story, which was really fun. But Elijah and Elisha. Now I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of what's going on here. So you find this primarily in the book of 2 Kings, but it does cross into another book of the Bible as well. But here's sort of what happens. So Elijah is a prophet called by God. Now, if you remember, prophets in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, were people who were chosen by God to go and speak truth, not only to God's people, but to others, especially nations and leaders, to say, hey, God wants you to be doing this, and you are heading down a bad path. And that bad path is going to lead you to destruction and a lot of other things, but God wants you to choose God's path. Usually the prophet's message had to do with justice, it had to do with taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves, it had to do with right worship, had to do with a lot of things like that. And so Elijah was a prophet in that tradition. And Elijah, up until the beginning of the story, had been going and challenging other prophets of Baal. You see Elijah doing these really cool miracles. Like, Elijah's a really established prophet when we get to the point in the story that we're at today. And so Elijah is walking through, as prophets do, a village, and he meets Elisha. And we get the sense that Elisha was younger at this point, potentially, but he meets Elisha, and Elisha is plowing in the field, and Elisha has 12 yoke of oxen. Now, anytime we see the number 12 in the Bible, that's a significant number, right? And it's usually having to refer to the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we see Elisha plowing with these 12 head of oxen. Elijah goes up to Elisha and puts a mantle over his head and back. Now, it's important to know that the mantle, which the best way to think about it is like a big cloak, okay? It was used for a lot of things. It was obviously used for warmth. It was used for protection against the sun. It could be used as sort of a shelter. If you were camping out and you needed shelter, it could be used for a multitude of different things, but it was a cloak. But beyond it being a cloak, it was a symbol of authority. Okay, so anytime we see a mantle in the Bible or the transition of a mantle, that's a really important piece for us to pay attention to. So Elijah goes up to Elisha and puts this mantle on Elisha. It says that Elisha immediately dropped everything he was doing, basically went and kissed his dad goodbye. He destroyed all of his plowing equipment, all of his farming equipment, and got all of those, basically all the food that he could find, and gave it to the village and said, "I'm out of here. Take everything." It was like that song that plays before worship. Sometimes it says, "Burn the ships, don't look back." That's the same kind of mentality that we see with the prophet Elisha going to follow Elijah. So, as with prophets and their successors in the Bible, Elisha follows Elijah around, and Elijah is essentially showing the ropes. Elijah's speaking to others, traveling from town to town, performing miracles, and Elisha is following around, watching these things happen. Now, eventually, we get to a point in the story where Elijah tells Elisha, "I'm going to be gone soon. I will not always be with you. I will be leaving very soon." Elisha expresses fear, expresses concern, expresses sadness and sorrow. And then we get to this really unique, and the Bible repeats itself in these stories and these trajectories oftentimes, but we get to a really unique part of the Bible that we literally don't see anywhere else in the Bible. It says that as Elijah was walking, it said that there was a great chariot of fire that started to come down from heaven, and that Elijah was taken up in this chariot of fire to God in heaven. It said as he was rising in this chariot of fire, Elisha is crying out to Elijah, and says, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." He shows this grief, and he screams out, he essentially screams out for a blessing. And he says, "Elijah, give me a double blessing, or a double portion of your blessing." And then there's this beautiful transition in the story where Elijah drops his mantle, that cloak, and it falls at the feet of Elisha. Elisha then takes that cloak, puts it on, and moves forward into God's next step of that ministry. Up until that point, like I said, there had been many miracles that had been done. And one of the last miracles was that Elijah and Elisha had gotten to the Jordan River. Some of you have been there just a few years ago on one of these pilgrimages. And he got to the Jordan River, and it said that he took his mantle off. It says that he wadded up and he slammed it against the waters of the Jordan. And when Elijah did that, the waters parted and he and Elisha crossed. After Elijah is taken up in this chariot of fire, the mantle has been dropped before Elisha. He picks it up. It says that he then goes back to the Jordan. He takes the mantle, he slams it down again, and that's where our scripture picked up this morning. It says he picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water. He said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Where is he?" He struck the water again, and the water was parted to one side and the other, and Elisha crossed over. Like I said, there's a lot of transitional stories in the Bible, these liminal spaces, but this one stuck out in particular to me. Because I think there are a number of subtle lessons that we can pick up as a congregation as we sit in this transitional liminal space. The first one is this. This is not the end. Okay? And I know when I was sitting in a Mexican restaurant with Tyler, when he looked across the table and told me that he was leaving, there was a moment inside of me that felt like this was the end. Now, I knew logically this is not the end. This is the United Methodist Church. We do this, okay? But you probably had something inside of you that bubbled similar to that, like, oh my gosh, it's like a gut punch. But what we have to remember is that this is not the end. And I love in this story that there was a successor, there was a next step, that God was not leaving the people of Israel, the followers of the prophet, was not leaving Elisha alone. In fact, Elisha says, "Give me a double portion." Now, this is a really interesting piece of scripture. Elisha wasn't saying, "Bless me double," okay? Make me greater than Elijah. When we see this double portion language, actually in the Bible, what that means is usually the eldest son, who would be the leader of the family if the father dies, the eldest son would get a double portion or a double blessing. And it was resources to be able to lead the family going forward. It was a way of saying, you're not going to suffer. You're not going to go without. You're not going to flounder and drift from this way and that. It's saying that you're going to be provided for. That leadership is coming. You're going to be provided for. We're not taking a step back. And so when we see this double portion, this double blessing language that Elisha asks for, it's a clear way of God saying, you are going to continue. You're going to be provided for. You will have what you need. Now, it's really cool in this story because if you actually go and count the number of miracles that Elijah did compared to the number of miracles that Elisha did, Elijah performed 8 miracles. If we follow the story of Elisha, he performed 16. So not only is that double portion language a way of saying that you're going to be taken care of, you're provided for, you'll have enough, it's also a blessing to say, and you will continue to grow. Grace, I want to tell you, we're provided for. We have enough, and we will continue to grow as God is calling us into this new future. The second thing I think that's really important from this story is that what was should not be exactly what is to come. You see, we'd really be messing up if we said, okay, everything that we've done for the past 6 years, that's got to be the game plan for the next 6. We'd be really limiting God. We'd be limiting God, we'd be limiting Brian, and we'd be limiting ourselves. Because it's not about being a carbon copy of what was. I thank God that Tyler didn't decide to be a carbon copy of what was before him. Because that's not faithful living. We can look at the story of the talents in the New Testament. You have the servant who buries the talents and says, hey, let's just keep it exactly how it is. And Jesus had a very harsh judgment of that. You see, it's not supposed to be a carbon copy, but it is supposed to be the same trajectory. One of the things that we see in the story of Elijah and Elisha, Elisha didn't make this crazy turn and then his ministry looked completely different or the opposite of what Elijah had done in the past. We actually see Elisha doing some of the same things that Elijah had done. In fact, the very first miracle that we see him do, getting the mantle, slamming it down on the Jordan River and the waters parting, is the last miracle that Elijah had done. So we see this trajectory, but what we see is an expansion of that trajectory. We see an expansion of, because Elijah's ministry had been about, as many of the prophets, taking care of those who couldn't take care of themselves, defending the widow and the orphan and the poor, providing for the people who are around. And if we go and look at Elisha's continued ministry, we see the same kind of stuff, except for with new audiences, new places, new people. We see the same kind of work, but we see it expanded. We are on a journey. We're on a trajectory, and we have been for years. That predates Tyler, it predates me, that predates many of you, that we've been on a trajectory as a church. When this church changed its name from Liberty Crossings to Grace, that was a movement in the trajectory of this church, in the trajectory that God had been calling and instilling and seeding in this church. The reason why after this service we'll go upstairs and celebrate a pride picnic is because we, as a church, continue on a trajectory that was set long, long ago. So, do we need to be a carbon copy? Absolutely not. But we are on a journey and we are on a trajectory. And when we stand up each Sunday and say we are a deep thinking, good grief, guys. Deep thinking, warm-hearted, Bible-based, inclusive community of Christ followers. I do that earlier in the service. My brain's not wired to do it right now. When we say that, when we started saying that a few years ago, that wasn't something that was like, hey, let's do something crazy. Let's come up with something wild. What we did was we said, hey, what reinforces the trajectory that we're on? And so we came up with deep thinking, warm-hearted, Bible-based, inclusive. And we say it over and over again because it affirms the trajectory that God continues to call us on. Another piece that really stands out about this story to me is it's not about a new DNA. And that follows that idea of trajectory. I used to do consulting for about 15 years. I still do a little bit now. And it was always wild when I would go into a church and do consulting with them, and they would come up with these ideas. Some of them were good. A lot of them weren't. I remember being it was an Episcopal church, a very, very high liturgy Episcopal church. All the smells, all the bells, like all the robes, all the things, okay? Like it was, they knew what they were doing, okay? And they did it well. And I was in this meeting, we were doing some visioning, and this person said, hey, I've got an idea. Here's what we should start doing as our church. And everybody sits in, they lean in, and the person says, I think we should start doing like a rock and roll service. And everybody just kind of looked around. They're like, what are you talking about? And this woman, she said, I think we need to do a rock and roll service. I think that'll bring in more people. And ultimately, as you can imagine, this whole thing failed miserably. They didn't try it, thank God. But this whole idea failed miserably because it wasn't in the DNA of that congregation. That congregation was a high liturgy, smells and bells. It was all the things that a rock and roll service was not. And one of the things that I made sure to tell them, and every consulting client I worked with from that point on, is God always wants you to dream. But God calls us to dream from the DNA of which we already belong to. God calls us to grow up from those deep roots that have already been seeded for years and years and generations and generations. And that's one of the things that I want to remind us of. We see this in the story of Elijah and Elisha, and I want to remind us that we get to grow from a beautiful foundation. We get to grow from a deep-rooted DNA that God is calling us to continue to build on. There are saints who have passed, and this is not an old church, okay? Let's just be clear. Like this church isn't 150 years old, okay? But there's already deep roots that tell us something about who we are. There are saints who have sat in this sanctuary, who we stand on their shoulders, and we get to continue and live into that legacy, that DNA of who God has continued to call us to be. And then last but not least, the story of Elijah and Elisha, it doesn't say this explicitly, but I think it might be the strongest message in the whole story. Elijah is the only person in the Bible who didn't die. It's kind of interesting. Gets caught up in a whirlwind. In certain Jewish traditions and meals, they'll actually leave a seat open for Elijah because Elijah never died. And that's pretty amazing, and that's a pretty cool part of the story, and it's miraculous and gives Elijah this kind of special connotation. But even with all that, I think the last and maybe most important lesson, the story wasn't about Elijah. The story was never about Elijah. Elijah was faithful. Elijah served. Elijah worked and did what God was calling Elijah to do and led God's people where God was calling Elijah to lead them. The story was never about Elijah. The story's always been about God. Because the story preceded Elijah. And it kept going after Elijah. The story's always been about God and God's love of God's people and God's world. This church was never about Tyler. A lot of you preceded Tyler. The story has always been about God. The story of grace has always been about God and this beautiful community of people that have been gathered under the name Grace. And I believe, and I know you do too, that this story continues. And it continues in beautiful and amazing ways. And we get to invite a new family into this story, the Sissons. And it won't be about them either. It's about God. It's about us. And it's about the beautiful work that God is, has, and will continue to do through this congregation. I want to go back as we close to this idea of the mantle. This cloak that was put over Elisha, this cloak that ultimately then belonged to Elisha. The mantle, it's a symbol of authority, of calling, of blessing, of confidence, of obedience. And it would be really easy for us to pick up that metaphorical mantle and put it on Brian's shoulders. And Brian needs to put on the mantle, and he will. But the mantle doesn't belong only to Brian. And what I hope you realize is it never only belonged to Tyler either. That mantle belongs to you. It belongs to me. It belongs to those saints who have gone on before us and those who will come. And so I guess my kind of closing challenge as we sit in this liminal space, not what was and not quite yet what will be, is what mantle will you put on? You have an opportunity over this week to think about what is it that you're going to take on. The reason why the past 6 years have been so beautiful and so successful is because it wasn't Tyler's mantle to wear. He had a part of it. But it's because so many of you continue to step up, continue to lead, continue to volunteer, continue to give. You took up your mantle, and the reason why the past 6 years have been so beautiful is because Tyler took up his and you took up yours. So my challenge, my hope for us is that we will take up that mantle. Not only will we take it up, that we'll pray and ask God how God is calling us to lead going forward, but that we'll make sure that Brian knows that. That when you have your initial conversations with him, that you'll say, hey, I'm so-and-so. I'm Kent. I volunteer with the youth. I would love if every one of you introduced yourself as, hey, I'm so-and-so, and here's the mantle that I wear at this church. And some of you can say the mantles that you already wear, and some of you get to tell him your mantle before he even knows that you're starting to wear that mantle just this week. But my prayer is that we'll all pick up the mantle, we'll take it forward, and walk into the beauty that God is calling us, Grace, a United Methodist congregation, into. Will you join me in prayer?